China. My name is Nupur Hasija. I serve as a Senior Program Manager with the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation Regional Office in New Delhi or South Asia. I'm delighted to have you join us for what promises to be an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. The Friedrich-Naumann Foundation is a German political foundation committed to advancing liberal values such as good governance, rule of law, education, and market economies. At FNF South Asia, we take pride in facilitating conversations on critical issues shaping our region, contributing to global dialogues on the challenges and opportunities in South Asia today. Today's webinar is a key platform for such a discussion, and the timing could not be more pertinent. As we approach the 90th birthday of His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama this year in July, we find ourselves reflecting on his extraordinary legacy and the future of Tibetan leadership. This milestone invites critical questions about succession within the Tibetan community, questions that are not only central to Tibetans, but are growing international interest. For over 35 years, since 1991, FNF has worked closely with the Tibetan community, particularly the Central Tibetan Administration, to foster democratic processes. Our contribution includes promoting internal democracy within the Central Tibetan Administration, providing global exposure through the programs such as study tours and hosting continuous discussions, webinars, and publications. FNF's role has been that of a facilitator, bringing together key stakeholders to address the most pressing issues facing the Tibetan community. The topic we explore today, Tibet's future and the Dalai Lama's legacy, is one that resonates deeply not within the community, but also across global stage. Before we begin the panel discussion and hear from our distinguished speakers, it is my great pleasure to introduce Thalon Dolma, the Security Minister of the Central Tibetan Administration. Dolmala is a prominent Tibetan freedom activist and has served in several key roles, including as the first female deputy speaker of the Tibetan Parliament in exile. She has held position of Kelon for the Department of Home, and she has run for the positions of Kelon, Tripa, and Sikyong in the past. Additionally, Dolmala has a long-standing commitment to social service, having founded the first Tibetan student-led organization dedicated to students' welfare and cooperation. Thank you so much, Dolmala, for being here today. And I would request you to give us valuable insights into the future of Tibetan leadership. Over to you.
Tashidelik to everybody and to the esteemed panelists. And on behalf of the Central Tibetan Administration and from my personal self, first of all, I would like to thank the FNF. Thank the FNF for organizing this webinar in honor of the Tibetans and all of us celebrating the 90th birthday of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And in fact, the topic that you have chosen, for discussion today is extremely interesting, timely, and important. However, I am extremely sorry that I would not be able to sit through the webinar, but I hope that we will get a recording of the same, which I can share with my colleagues, the Kashak over here. So I would like to request the organizers for that. And as Nupur very briefly, introduced FNF and of the special relation that FNF has with the Central Tibetan Administration, and in particular, we are in deep gratitude to the support that we have received from the FNF for the past over several decades for the Tibetan cause, for the visions of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, for the democratization process that the Tibetans in exile has been engaged in. We are extremely grateful and value your partnership. And we remember the Tibetan Parliamentary and Policy Research Center and its service to the community with great pride and appreciation. Today, I would also like to make a special mention of Dr. Klein. Dr. Klein, thank you for your friendship, your courage. And I had this chance to personally engage with you, see you in work, your selfless dedication, service to humanity, your understanding of the values that His Holiness the Dalai Lama holds high, for your genuine support for the Tibetan cause. I thank you, your leadership, Dr. Klein, and also, of course, as Nupurji mentioned, I have seen you now, slowly, gracefully, wonderfully aging in your service with FNF over the past 3 decades. And we Tibetans, all that we have come across, Nupurla, FNF, we all value your service, your friendship, and we look forward to working together and carrying forward the task that we have taken together. And also, of course, Mr. Frank Hoffman, was wonderful to meet you this time, to be with you, and all your group, Tenzin Panjula, thank you so much. So today's webinar is also a result of your, dedication and your wish to do something for Tibet. So I thank you very, very, very much. And I do see that you have, panelists, speakers from different backgrounds. So the Honorable Member of Tibetan Parliament, Namgyal, Dolkar, Lhagyari, a very powerful woman leader, outspoken, sometimes lands her in trouble for being honest and truthful in her stand. Yes, so I think you have wonderful panelists here. And then my very old colleague and president of the ICT, Semotenshala, yet another strong Tibetan leader who has dedicated life in service. We have been members of the parliament together. Then also I see many other speakers. So all of you, thank you so much for taking time out today and being here together to talk on a topic celebrating, as you say, the Dalai Lama's legacy and Tibet's future. When we talk about the legacy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I believe it is in one way very easy to speak on the legacy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because in one way it is so simple, it is so transparent, it is so understandable. But yet, I think His Holiness the Dalai Lama is such one individual leader, a personality, who has various aspects. In this one avatar, he has several different avatars. When you look at His Holiness the Dalai Lama as a leader or a former ruler of Tibet, a leader who in exile have actually been able to democratize the old system. So if you look into the political legacy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, there are again different areas of legacy that, one could countlessly account. Then you can also look at His Holiness the Dalai Lama for being a leader whose people have been murdered, killed. Over 1.2 million Tibetan peoples have died as a direct result of China's illegal occupation of our country, Tibet. Hundreds and thousands of monasteries destroyed. You're uprooted, separated from your own people, the land that you call your country, your home. You're displaced. But yet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama not only chose for himself, but showed the path to the Tibetan people of non-violence. And for finding a lasting political solution through dialogue. So there are different aspects if you look at His Holiness in that. Then as a religious leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama would be remembered in the history of Tibet as the religious head who in his own government, who in his own administration, which is called the Ganden Potang, till His Holiness chose to devolve his political power, devolve and hand all his political power to elected political leaderships. In this Ganden Potang, which traditionally would be a Gelugpa or one particular sect's government, His Holiness the Dalai Lama chose to give equal right, equal power to all the various sects in Tibetan Buddhism, including our traditional religion of Burma. And then also His Holiness the Dalai Lama's role towards religious harmony, towards universal responsibility. And in fact, when you talk about environment, I would believe that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is one of the greatest environmentalists in the world, as early as in 1987 in his 5-point peace proposals. In 87. Now people are talking a lot about environment, which is very, very good. His Holiness in his 5-point peace proposal had talked about protection of environment, with concern about deforestation inside Tibet, denuclearization and dumping of nuclear waste. His Holiness had talked about Tibet being a zone of peace. So I think there are various aspects. The legacy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama is a universal legacy, a legacy that extends and crosses boundaries. So therefore, I'm very happy that today you are going to be discussing on the legacy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, a perspective from Europe, South Asia, and China. And of course, interesting that you would be discussing about Tibet's future also. That's always wonderful. It is, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama always advises us, we should always prepare ourselves, work for the best result, and yet be prepared to accept the worst. So therefore, to talk about one's future or one country's future and to discuss various perspectives are very, very important. And at this time, as we celebrate the 90th birthday of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we also celebrate the fact that His Holiness the Dalai Lama will be with us for few decades to come. And also Tibet's, Nupur, I just wanted to add, or just to clarify something. Sometimes we talk about successes, and Well, I'm just putting it forward so that, your panelists can also maybe have better time and better knowledge and ways of putting it more appropriately. As far as when we talk about successor of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, from the spiritual point of view, from the religious point of view, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, today's Dalai Lama, we know is the 14th. And the next one, Dalai Lama, we are in no hurry, but would be the 15th Dalai Lama for sure. So that is one. Secondly, because His Holiness the Dalai Lama chose not to have a political successor, chose not to play any active role in the political aspect of Tibetan polity, His Holiness the Dalai Lama devolved all his political powers, so, and gave it to the popularly, democratically elected leaders. So therefore, I think when we talk about the political Tibet, it should be in the in exile. I mean, you all know what it is. Yes, so I just wanted to, make a comment here, and I will not want to take too much time now. And I thank all of you for taking time out, and those people who are, participating on the webinar. Also, thank you very much. And I look towards celebrating the legacy of His Holiness forward. Each one of us individually, as a community, as an organization. And Nupurla, Dr. Klein, we're looking forward to receiving all of you here during the birthday celebration. And as you know, the Tibetans, are observing from the 6th of July 2025 to the 6th of July 2026 as the year of compassion. So let us all try to spread love, compassion, and universal oneness. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dolmala, for the valuable insights at the future and talking about the future of Tibet. And thank you for your friendship and association. I'm now excited to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Swati Chawla. Swati, if you could allow me, I would like to first introduce you as a FNF alumni and a friend of FNF since more than a decade. Dr. Chawla is Associate Professor and Historian specializing in modern South Asia and the Himalayas. Currently, she serves as Assistant Director at the Center for Learning and Innovative Pedagogies at Jindal Global University, focusing on learner-centered pedagogy. Dr. Chawla teaches courses on Tibetans in India, migration, digital humanities, among other subjects. Thank you so much, Swati, for agreeing to moderate this important discussion today. And without further ado, I will now hand over you the proceedings. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm delighted to be moderating this discussion, honoring His Holiness on his upcoming birthday. I've been in many panels in the past few months about succession, about reincarnation, about what India's position should be, etc. But it's refreshing, and I think it's timely and important to actually have a panel that honors his legacy. So to not look nervously at the future and make predictions, but to actually, stand firmly in the present and look back at what has been a wonderful legacy. And to celebrate a milestone birthday, I think that's always a wonderful thing. So today we are exploring his enduring impact both on Tibet's future, for human rights advocacy, for cultural preservation, but also his abiding personal legacy. And that's what I talk about in some of my work among Himalayan peoples, both in India and elsewhere, in Bhutan, for example, and both Buddhist and non-Buddhists. I'm especially grateful to FNF for decades of work in supporting Tibetan research, advocacy, and capacity building in exile. In fact, my own early work as a young scholar back in Delhi University was deeply shaped by the volumes Indian Parliament on the issue of Tibet, which Nupur had actually lent me from the FNF Delhi Library. And this was a project that the foundation supported, and these volumes were compiled by the Tibetan Parliamentary and Policy Research Center, TPPRC, which Kalon Dolmagyari just mentioned in her remarks. And they were actually compiled under the current Sikyong Pempat Sering's leadership of the TPPRC at the time. So it's sort of like coming back and in immense gratitude for me. So the event brings together three remarkable speakers whose work also has profoundly informed my own and made it possible. We have Ms. Tencho Gatso, President of the International Campaign for Tibet. Tenchola had served in a previous role as Interim Vice President and Director of Outreach at the ICT. She has held several ICT member and congressional staffer trips to Dharamshala and plays an active role in ICT's advocacy team to advance its legislative agenda and to educate the wider public about Tibet at community conferences and universities. Next, we have Dr. Dawa Lokitsang, who is an academic, a Tibetan-American political and historical anthropologist. Her scholarship looks at Tibetan agency as an anti-colonial effort in response to China's developing imperial colonialism in Tibet. Her work on Tibetan schools in India historicizes the national agency of Tibetans in exile and examines how the preservation of their national and spiritual identity became grounds for community building and movement-generating efforts that regularly unsettled China's settler colonial consumption of Tibet. She will soon be starting, she just informed us, a postdoctoral fellowship at Leiden University. Finally, we have Ms. Namgyal Dolkar Lhagyari, member of the current 17th Tibetan Parliament in exile from the Utsang province. She was previously elected to the 16th Parliament, and prior to that, she taught literature at the DBS Postgraduate College, and then she joined the Tibetan Women's Association to work as a project coordinator for legal empowerment of Tibetan women. From 2013 to 16, she was also the vice president of the Guchusum Movement Association of Tibet, and she was then elected the president of the association. She's also the vice president of the Free Indo-Pacific Alliance. So we are now almost 23 minutes in. I have a few opening questions. These are common questions for the three panelists. And if they could each take maybe 3 to 4 minutes, and then we'll move on to specific questions. And audience members, please keep your questions coming. If some of your questions allude to some, or are similar to some questions that I had written down, we'll club them together. Or if they refer to something specific that was just said, I might interrupt the panelist and I might ask them to address your question right then. Otherwise, we would take all of them at the end, but please keep them coming. So to begin with, I had 3 sets of questions. How do each of you see His Holiness's legacy? And what does it mean for you personally and politically? What responsibilities and openings come with this moment for Tibetans in exile? And in your role, in your domain of work, how do you understand your responsibility? So as an academic, as an activist, as a member of parliament, and how are Tibetan futures being shaped beyond Dharamshala? So if we could begin with Dawala, and then we'll go around the panel. Thank you.
Thank you for that invitation, Swati, and thank you to FNF for having me here. So I want to start by situating the present. Right now, we're in the era of geopolitical wars, and we're also experiencing the rise of authoritarian governments and populist candidates. In such a situation, His Holiness's legacy moves beyond just ourselves within the Tibetan community. for modeling a kind of leadership that I describe as unique and particularly Tibetan. We have a figure who voluntarily gave away his power in order to create a democratic structure for his people. Whereas in authoritarian situations and even in histories of governments, especially modern governments, we have candidates who are actually vying for power. And we're seeing that right now. So he has modeled a kind of leadership that is unique in the world, especially considering the present. So I consider his legacy beyond, touching beyond the Tibetan community and influencing the world in a manner of what a selfless kind of leadership can actually look like, because he manifests it. And as far as his legacy, I mean, in terms of my work, I'm constantly looking at him as the main architecture of our lives. He basically pretty much created the political, social, cultural, and religious institutions that we as Tibetans rely on, and has shaped our futures in the present. When I talk about myself personally, I am my father went to the Tibetan school system, which happens to be my research. And, you know, I came as a result of him. So in many ways, I am directly touched by not only his legacy, but his continuing work with the Tibetan community. So in that sense, his influence and legacy reaches just beyond, like, of course, the Tibetan community, but also beyond, especially for a kind of modeling of leadership, but also for people who are fighting authoritarian regimes and colonial occupation. So he is continues to be an inspiration for people seeking freedom from authoritarianism and colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Namgyal Dolkar.
Tasle, everyone. Thank you, FNF, for inviting me and being part of this amazing two ladies that I'm co-paneling with. So thank you for having me, especially for such an important topic that really means a lot to each one of the Tibetan community, especially inside Tibet. So here's a hope that, you know, what we say reflects upon what the Tibetans inside Tibet feels about His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. And I completely endorse what Dawa Loki Sangla said about His Holiness and how important he touches each one of us as individual. For me, this is something that I've always mentioned about His Holiness, of how he really encompasses what compassion in action means. An individual who, with all the power that he possessed, and where he was in a scenario where every individual wanted him to be the leader. Here is him, where he is suggesting that, no, it is you who will lead the movement. So we haven't had such a leader, very few leaders around the world. And I would add on His Majesty, the King of Bhutan in this discussion as well, how it's been very few leaders around the world who has really handed over the power, the authority to the people, and allowed and let us know that, you know, you are capable, right? Because for me, as an individual, but particularly as a Tibetan woman, for us to be able to see Tibetan women coming out, leading the movement, leading the Tibetan freedom movement at every stage, it is his legacy. And for me, as a Ranzenbach, an individual who endorses complete independence of Tibet, when I see the future of Tibet, I see His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama back in his rightful position. So even for somebody, individual like us, who's viewed upon as controversial for our political, belief, we have His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama in our hearts. And his language and his, the values that he really endows. So for us, it's His Holiness is about all of these things, about immense resilience, despite the most difficult circumstances that him as an individual has gone through. And I think for the Tibetans, we always look at him, even the younger generation, as this superhuman, right? But I always feel like he is just a human being. And for him to be able to really control himself emotionally and pick himself up as an individual, making sure that, okay, I have to be strong for my people, and to gather that willpower, that determination to be able to, really hand over that strong connection to each one of us. So I think that is what His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama is for many of us, and include, especially for me. This is what I can say. And yes, for me, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama is certainly a compassion in action, and a I always mention that he is a reformer that the world needs. And for me, he's beyond just a religious leader. He is a reformer for me, a true Democrat. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Tenchala?
Hello, thank you so much, Swati and FNM for organizing this and inviting us as panelists here. I wanted to start off by former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, what she said about His Holiness. To Tibetan Buddhists, he is the earthly manifestation of the living Buddha. To the international community, he is the spiritual leader of the Tibetan people. To millions of believers and admirers, he is a source of wisdom and compassion. To young people, His Holiness is a positive example of how to make the world a better place. So, as speakers ahead have said, I think His Holiness touches so many, not just Tibetan world, but beyond. And then for myself, as a Tibetan born and brought up in the 60s in Dharamshala, I think I was able to be there in the front lines, seeing how His Holiness orchestrated our existence outside, and as a figure who is there in every part of our lives. You know, we grew up with his blessings, with the care, with the love, with, you know, with the, even as refugees, that we were able to grow up with a sense of confidence and pride of who we are and where we come from. So I think that's really important. I think when I think back, I think of His Holiness as being only 25 when he came into exile in India. So at that young age, he had the vision and the conviction, and also carried the responsibility that was entrusted on him by his people to really have a vision that wasn't about himself alone, but was much, much bigger than himself, and build something that today we all are able to, our lives are enriched because of that. And I think it's also how he was able to not only do the work himself, but inspire a whole generation of Tibetans to work with him to build a whole structure of where we have, you know, a whole a government in exile, an education system, monasteries, cultural centers of learning, all of it outside. But it was his inspiration and how his leadership that brought all these people into single-minded dedication to serve him and do something for this for our people. So I think when I think of his legacy, I think of that. And then I also think how even when he was in the early stages, he had, the whole world was, he didn't have any support. I remember when His Holiness autobiography, how he says when he arrived at the Indian border, he looked back at the Chushikangdu, the army, the Tibetan army who had helped him to the border, and he looked back and he said, okay, they are going back, I'll probably never see them again. And then he looks towards India and he says, I'm heading towards a universe, a world of strangers. And then from that, he built a whole connection for Tibet. From that, talking first, when he couldn't talk about political issues, he talked about what he knew of his culture and of how Tibetan wisdom and culture can be of benefit for the world. And in that, he made Tibet relevant to the world, to scientists, to modern education, and connected from a refugee with just the robes that he was wearing to being celebrated all around the world, being able to be with world leaders and bring Tibet at the highest level. So I think his legacy is really huge. And now today, I think as we look, for those of us who have benefited from this, for us, the test also will be, how do we lay the foundation for the future? Who will carry this legacy forward? And I think in that, the younger Tibetans that we engage with, that who are on the panel here, I think everyone will be part of carrying this forward and figuring how we do this into the future.
Thank you so much. And if I can just take 30 seconds and speak as an Indian, His Holiness often jokes that his body has been fed on dal bhat, on lentils and rice, and his mind on the Nalanda masters. So I think India also should and does rightfully claim him as one of its most exemplary sons. I have argued that India should confer its highest civilian honor, the Bharat Ratna, on His Holiness, not for what it means for him, but what it says about us, to honor him, and what he's done for Himalayan Buddhists, many of whom are educated in Tibetan children's village schools and go to monasteries and nunneries that the community in exile has set up. And also as a proponent of ahimsa, nonviolence, and karuna, that's compassion, principles that he attributes to India's Buddhist traditions. And he's also among the most preeminent Gandhians in the world. In fact, in his Nobel acceptance speech, he said he honored Gandhi and his legacy. So, absolutely what all of you said, it's a model for leadership, not just for the Tibetan people, but for the world at large. Questions have already started coming in. We are doing well on time, but let's move on. So I had some individual questions for each of you. And again, if we could just each take about 5 minutes, so then that will leave us a good half an hour for discussion later. So I'll start with Namgyal Dolkar. Democracy actually in the Tibetan exile context has been described as a gift from His Holiness. In your remarks and Dawala's remarks, you alluded to that, someone who gave up power voluntarily in 2011. How do you see Tibetans in exile today negotiating both a reverence for him, but also sometimes an impatience or an irreverence, perhaps, with how things are, with the direction or the means or the pace of the movement, or maybe just frustration with how things have turned out? And how do MPs like yourself, how have you tried to bring in more meaningful representation within the parliament, within CTA institutions more broadly? If you could, so about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Well, I would say irreverence is a very strong word. I think disagreement within a democratic setup is something that is expected out of democracy, and something that His Holiness has reiterated several times is how, for him in 1956, when he came to India and was able to visit the Indian Parliament, he was immediately, taken back towards his participation in the Chinese Communist People's Congress, as they call, of how everything was entirely orchestrated. Nobody could say anything, as opposed to the Indian Parliament, where he mentioned that the Parliament members were free to express themselves as they really feel and criticize the government when they think it's necessary. So this was the foundation of how he realized that this is something that we need as Tibetans, right? So for me, when we have been brought up in an environment where we have cherished democracy as a space where we could offer different opinion, we could include different views, political or otherwise. And this has been a system, not just in politically, but even in terms of Buddhism. His Holiness always talks about how we should learn and question the teachings of Buddha as well. So for me, this is what democracy means. And this is what His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama expects out of each one of us, not just as the people, but as the lawmakers, as myself. And for me, I think it's crucial if we actually want to see a better, legacy of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, where I believe that the Tibetan government exile is one of the most important work that he has established for us, and something an institution that really is the only and the sole true legitimate representative of the Tibetans around the world, including the Tibetans inside Tibet. So for that sort of institution to prosper and to be able to survive, it's important that each one of us are able to plate in our different opinion. And this is exactly what we're seeing right now. And I think what we really need as people is to try and take in a little bit of, perhaps seek a little bit of patience and a little bit of compassion and a little bit of acceptance and empathy from His Holiness, and perhaps grant that within our own community to make sure that this is how we will begin our dialogue amongst ourselves before we go ahead with any sort of dialogue with the Chinese Communist Party, our counterpart. So this is how I see the Tibetan democracy, and this is exactly where we are today. So we have a very few section in our community who believe that what is happening seems to be a chaos. For me, I see that as a true democracy, something that His Holiness endowed to us. And for us to make sure that it goes on a right trajectory, it's important that different voices come in, right? So I believe that there's still a lot of work to do, certainly, to make sure that the Tibetan government exile, this democratic establishment, is placed back to a free Tibet as a democratic Tibet. So this is actually a trial mode for us, and I think we are doing a pretty fair job. We are still learning. Clearly, we are still learning at the moment, where we are making many mistakes, but I don't see that as a harm, because today we always mention that His Holiness is there to kind of guide us. It's embarrassing for me to even declare that we are still politically relied upon His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, especially in terms of making our democratic decision. But that is the reality. It is because he has learned through his difficult experiences of how a state should be run, how an exiled government should be run, but more importantly, how a Tibetan freedom movement should be run. So hence, I believe that we're lucky today that he's here guiding us, but we are well aware that what he foresees for Tibet is for the people to be self-reliant politically, most importantly. So for me, that shall be the legacy of Tibet from His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, how he allowed the people to be confident enough to work for ourselves, to guide ourselves together as a community, as a movement, as a Tibet, right? So yes, so this is how I see the movement right now. This is how I see His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama's involvement in this, and how we can move on from here. And how, for me, this is something that I've mentioned several times, of how I see the level of confidence that he's shown in us, and especially when it comes to the younger generation of Tibetans, despite the different kind of community that we belong to in terms of tribe, which traditional region of Tibet you come from, which religious background you come from, which family background, which educational background you come from, economic background, we all know that we are one as Tibetan, right, we can pursue whatever we wish to in terms of our career, in terms of our political opinion, but we shall do that for the future of Tibet as the people, right? So this is how I see us proceeding, and this is how I am confident, because I see the younger generation of Tibetans doing just that, of in a way kind of disregarding the smaller identity into a recognition of the larger identity as a nation. And of course, while doing that, respecting the democratic concept of inclusion as well. So I think we are on the right track at the moment. My only worry is for us to continue to be able to represent the Tibetans inside Tibet.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And maybe you can return to that point about representing the voices of Tibetans inside Tibet, if there are questions. We move now to Tenshara. I think it was Desmond Tutu who said, who are the Chinese going to talk to if they can't talk to this man of peace? And that's something that's, stayed with me. So how has His Holiness's personal diplomacy, you think, shaped global support for Tibet? And what strategies would be needed to sustain it in the future? How do you read this historical moment? Davala alluded to recent elections across the world and what that's changed for us. But also recently, the many Tibet support resolutions that have been passed, especially in the US, and you are in Virginia, so close to DC. What opportunities does this moment hold for raising international visibility and solidarity for the Tibetan movement? Over to you.
Thank you, Swati. I think being here, working in Washington, DC, I've been able to be a viewer of His Holiness's diplomacy and his efforts for political support for Tibet. And I think this really goes also, even with in the most high level of political spaces, trust and respect as individuals carries a long way. And I think His Holiness in how he has led his life and been leading the Tibetan struggle, people see in him a person who stands for truth, justice, who is wise, who has a vision that is bigger than Tibet, and a vision that is to benefit humanity and the world. So I think in that, he has the respect globally, and that has really helped build political support for Tibet. And I think his charisma, even from his early visits, just how he speaks and reaches out to, whether it's individuals, whether it's political leaders, whether it's religious leaders, whether it's businessmen, whether from whatever field, interaction with him, you get a sense that he's in tune with you. He understands you. He speaks with you. You hear from him. And that connection, I think, has served the political legacy for Tibet. And I think all of these, you mentioned, the successes of Tibet legislation in the United States, all of this is because of the foundation that His Holiness has left here from his many visits, from his interactions. I mean, at a really difficult political space in Washington, when he was here at one time when when Democrats and Republicans weren't getting any business done, His Holiness arrived, and you had the top leaders coming together in celebrating him and sitting together at the same table to have a meal, and brings both sides of the aisle together. I mean, there's very little issues that can do this at such a high level. So I think this really goes, shows us why the Tibet has been successful and why His Holiness has been successful. And I then think, going to the future for Tibet, this is a legacy that we Tibetans have to build on. I think for younger Tibetans as well, there is a whole resource of learning available there to understand where we come from, the richness of Tibetan culture and what it has brought forth. His Holiness' new book is out. It's called Voice for the Voiceless. He details in here his struggles with China for Tibet and how he has viewed it. And his vision has always been inclusive of all the people and building towards something where Tibet can contribute not just for Tibetans, but for the world community, to build a better humanity for all of us, to build a better world and a place where people care about each other, and that it's not just about the self, but that it's for all of us. And I think that message for me, as I grow older, I feel, it's I feel it even more stronger, and that it serves all of us as we also look to the future legacy of His Holiness and going forward. And then, as you mentioned about what the opportunities for raising international visibility, this year is His Holiness's 90th year. And the Central Tibetan Administration has declared it a year of compassion. We at International Campaign for Tibet also, we want to take on this as a challenge to share His Holiness's message, to take it again on a tour, even as His Holiness isn't traveling, and he's as much traveling these days around the world. We have so much material of his teachings, his books, the documentaries about him, and so many also young lamas and teachers and others who have taken his wisdom and be able to share it widely. So to take all of these and his words on a world tour and take it forward with us, so that, we even as he's resting in Dharamshala, we're taking his teachings on a tour around everywhere around the world. So that's something we envision that we're going to be trying to do this year, having many events as we can, bringing his message to a wider audience. And I think that's a way to elevate all of us who care about him and who care about Tibet.
Thank you. And speaking of diplomacy, I'm reminded that when His Holiness first met Prime Minister Nehru, that was actually 1954. He was 19 years old, I teach at university now, Dagala does as well. Think of some of our students, he was 19. And with him was His Holiness the Panchen Lama, who was 16 at the time. And they are with Chou Enlai in his 50s, Nehru in his 60s. And the first meeting in exile, with Nehru was 70 at the time. His Holiness hadn't yet turned 24. This is March 1959. His birthday is, of course, in July. So from that age, to be shouldering this and with such dignity and just exceptional personal integrity, so I think that's really, as you've all said, a model and very, very rare. So we move on now finally to Davala, and we've spoken actually very briefly, we've already alluded to the TCV schools. So how do you see His Holiness's leadership of institutions in exile, especially schools, as a material architect, as you say in your work, of the community itself, especially in the first few decades? What has made these institutions so durable across generations, and how have they shaped Tibetan futures? And finally, as Tibetans navigate transitions in leadership and possible succession, what kinds of conversations do you think are needed to ensure, and these are your words again, that Tibetan avenues towards cultural continuity and futurity are not narrow and that they are actually wide and expansive? Over to you.
Thank you for that question. So again, I'm going to situate myself right now. I'm in North America, right? And North American, Native American communities have suffered under settler colonial occupation for the last 400 to 500 years. And what's interesting is we're also in the era of Native and Indigenous resurgence movements, sovereignty movements, land back movements. And in many ways, these communities are reeling back from hundreds of years of colonial boarding schools and policies of dispossession that Tibet is currently experiencing. And what's interesting is the colonial boarding school is being weaponized in Tibet right now as we speak. So when we frame the kind of architecture role that His Holiness played, he has played it in all of these cultural, political, spiritual institutions, but specifically I'm looking at the educational institutions, right? And when you kind of see these communities are reeling back after 400, 500 years, trying to create revitalization of language and culture in their own communities after suffering under imperial settler colonialism. And we have a leader who began that project upon invasion. This is something very different, very unique. And you can see him being this young and seeing ahead of time. Right away, his vision of the future was collective. And his vision of the future included children. Of course, he was concerned with everybody, but children are quite literally the future. I tend to teach his autobiography to my students. And when you read his autobiography, you notice that he was moved by the deaths of Tibetans in the settlement, in the refugee camps. And he became completely concerned, especially about the future of Tibet. And so his need for, he was the first one to found the first Tibetan school and the nursery, the school in Mussoorie that later became CSD, and the nursery that later became TCV. These were from his own coffers of finance. The other thing that a lot of people don't know is he has financed most of these institutions. We talk about our donors, but he's been the biggest donor of all of this, continues to be. So you can already see that he was already thinking about this way ahead of time. So one of the things that I like to highlight is the fact that I think Tibetans for a long time, because of our tragedy of having lost our country, and because we thought we were going to go back to Tibet anytime soon, like this belief still percolates with the older generation that we're going to go back anytime soon. We're going to go back to our home. In many ways, that kind of way of seeing the return home kept us from actually thinking about exile as a historical space also. This is something I like to emphasize. And it's something that I've noticed that even Tibetans are not quite aware of. When I attended Future of Tibet conferences, especially in places like Dharamshala, I say, you guys are so used to this little town that's already built, so used to this Tibetan government institutions, so used to these schools. These are your everyday spaces. You don't even realize it's been built by people who imagined this and who built it together with their labor, right? So, we have, in many ways, I'm trying to reimagine by historicizing exile, because it's a story of building together. It's not just an ideological space that we were imagining together. We were quite literally building it together, you know. So I think these are much more interesting kind of things to focus on rather than ideological, you know. But so it was Tibetans who physically built these worlds. It was their labor. The other thing is His Holiness talks about, especially Dinshala already mentioned, he talks this book where he basically says, you know, at the age of two, he became responsible for the nation and the people of Tibet. And since he has carried that duty of protecting Tibet and its people, as well as our culture, at the center of my heart, and will do so as long as I am alive. This kind of ethic, this kind of politic, is what inspired his generations who he recruited to care after children, right? The directors of the school of TCV, CST, and Tibetan Homes Foundation. These, in one sense, they were like, this is the command of His Holiness, so I'm going to fulfill it in a very traditional sense in terms of my teacher. But on top of that, he was modeling a kind of selflessness, a kind of leadership that was inclusive, that they were also inspired by, that they reproduced. And this is where I talk about him creating literal futures, because they kind of modeled the kind of selfless care and compassion towards their children that they basically adopted and created families for. A lot of the first generations were orphans who lost their parents either inside Tibet during the invasion, occupation, or on the journey. And these people quite literally, including His Holiness, became their parents and guided them throughout their life. And in many ways, that became modeled with the first generation of students whose kind of ethics towards their community. You know, like my father was part of that generation. He has always raised me with this clear understanding that I have a responsibility to my people. And this comes from people. This is a pedagogy, right? It's passed down. So in my line of work, I do think not just with Tibetans, but also with academics, there's this tendency to see us as just, you know, victims of tragedy. But I'm also saying we're not just victims. You know, Tibetans led their own destiny. And we had the guidance of a leader who was so self-giving that we were able to create this, not only this community that is modeled for all these other refugee communities, but a movement that challenges the rise of a new empire, the Chinese empire. And these children are given a national history, so much so that they can challenge China's narrative in the geopolitics of Asia, you know? So, you know, the children who graduate from Tibetan schools can tell what's happening on the Himalayan borderlands when there are skirmishes happening. They can recall Tibetan history, right? And explain how these like new ways of conquering new lands on the Himalayan geography is directly about Tibetan history. Of course, China doesn't say it that way. China is co-opting Tibetan history these days. So, you know, in many ways, I am trying to challenge Tibetan views of their experience in exile, but also academic views of us as just victims who are just victims of tragedies. In many ways, his way of shaping and envisioning Tibetan destinies have been manifested. And so my question to the young people these days, one of the things that Tibetan youth, I remember one group kind of fighting over what the Tibetan future should look like or what it should be. And I laughed and I said, you know, you guys are quite literally the future. Like how we shape the present matters because that's going to shape the future. What you do right now is what's going to create tomorrow. And I think that's when they're like, oh, okay, it's not somewhere out there.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for that point about His Holiness personally funding these early efforts and continuing to actually. So Davala and I are both also alums of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. We've both been fellows there. And that, of course, was established with the funds from the Nobel Peace Prize. You know, that to me got me started. I spent a summer at Dolma Ling Nunnery, which also, like you say, was literally built brick by brick by the nuns themselves. So quite literally built by the community in exile, along with, other nunneries under the Tibetan Nuns Project. But we have two questions already, and one of them is actually from this book that both of you have shown us. I'm only 50 pages in, so but the question is by Tenzing Hamdul from the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives, FNVA, here in Delhi. He also reminded me that it's an all-women panel, so that's wonderful. And I'm also glad we haven't called attention to it yet, because it, really shouldn't be an all-male panel. Didn't call attention for so long. So I'm glad. And Dhandul's question is that after reading the book, Voice for the Voiceless, over second decades of struggle with China for my land and my people, His Holiness makes it clear that the Tibet-China conflict is not limited to the Dalai Lama, but it is for the Tibetan people. How do we as Tibetans carry forth his legacy in exile politically, among other things, that began with the Great Oath of Unity in 1960 and spearheading the re-establishment of a reunited Tibet, supported by Tibetans both in Tibet and in exile? Would any of you like to take it up?
Well,
Sure.
I'll quickly say that I mean, like, he created the entire structure of exile for us, and including the creation of the Tibetan government was so that the movement and the organization of Tibetan community could continue with or without him. So he was thinking of this starting from 1960. So, the fact that he was thinking this way ahead, but I don't think the Tibetans were quite there in terms of understanding how far ahead he had been imagining the future. But I also think that there is this tendency in the Tibetan movement. I mean, and I think it's the tragedy of not being able to have our country back. We've spearheaded this movement for about 70 years now, and we still feel like we have had no resolution. So there is a lot of frustration, which is understandable. But I also think, like I've said before, I don't think that Tibetans quite understand these in the larger geopolitics of things and the macro politics of things. And it's really important to situate our movement within these contexts. And I do think that, like, there is this tendency to just look at these issues as if, like, it's within it's always about internal, like, conflict. But I like, for example, right now, what's happening under Xi Jinping, scholars of China is only just starting to learn that, he's changing a lot of policies inside Tibet, so much so that he is changing a lot of the autonomy policies. This is not something that I've seen Tibetan activists or our politicians even articulate. I mean, even to be fair to them, even academics are having a hard time understanding that a lot of these false promised autonomy rights are actually being taken away structurally. And we have not been the best at communicating that. So I think, this middle way versus, like, autonomy discussion and, like, ideological fighting is so stupid, because it's so unaware of the fact that right now Xi Jinping is actually taking away the remnants of what they think is autonomy, so, like, we're far from these ideological conversations when we're not actually looking at the reality of policy shifts happening in Tibet that's taking away basic rights. For example, the right to have to learn your mother tongue. These operate under the rights of autonomy. These are slowly being taken away. And our, like, activists are so busy having these ideological conversations, we're not even having conversations about the reality of structural policy shifts that are actually aiming at erasing our identity. So, sometimes I do think we get carried away with our own little internal, like, conversations, that we're not looking at the macro politics of what China's doing, And all of this has everything to do with China's need to control Tibet's, like, land and resources. I mean, lithium, everything is going in the direction of, like, electric cars. And I mean, look at the war in, like, Ukraine. Russia and the US is both vying for these, like, earth minerals, right? Which are going to be, these are all extractive capitalism. China is shifting its policy inside Tibet primarily because they are aiming for these resources that are technically protected under autonomy laws. So there are these massive shifts happening that not even academics or the Tibetans are catching on to. So I do think we need to be better at understanding the larger issues at play that impact us. Because I do think we are so used to just having internal conversations, and it's just that.
Yeah. And in fact, Namgyal Dolkar had talked about the 5-point peace plan, which back in the day brought attention to all this, right? So thinking of Tibet as a zone of peace, and this isn't just, it's just words. But if you look at what's happening today, you're quite right. And we have to take that more seriously about the stewardship of ecological resources. And that's really what so much of this is about. Namgyal Dolkar, I saw that you unmuted yourself. Would you like to come in on this question?
Sure. I would say that, it's certainly, being in exile for many decades now, and especially now under the leadership of Xi Jinping and its clique, of how he is playing along the game of control and surveillance. I think he has been, if not emotionally, he has been really successfully able to bring in a vacuum of dialogue amongst the Tibetans. Over the years, social media, of course, way before that, it was the Tibetans coming in exile, bringing in the information, their narratives, their stories, and living here, and then, staying connected with their family members. And that changed with smuggling information. And then the social media came in. I think with everything, now it's become so much difficult to control information under his, Xi Jinping's leadership, that I think, in a way, it's becoming much more difficult for the academics to bring in a sort of information for the Tibetan government or the activists to be really able to carry on activism that will model the voices of Tibetans inside Tibet, the suppressed voices and the silenced voices of Tibetans inside Tibet. So I think that is where the real danger lies, and hence how I hope in coming future, in terms of Tibet advocacy, is for us to be able to break those hurdles of media control, of information relaying control that is going on without causing a difficulty for the Tibetans inside Tibet. We know that one information of self-immolation that has come to us has caused arrest and detention and literally life of entire family and entire village. So how do we ensure that we're able to receive information, ensure that they are safe, and that we're able to go around, do our responsibility of Tibet advocacy? I think those are the major challenges of how we carry on the Tibet movement. And along with that, the question that has come in is how I think Tibetans, we usually tend to focus that, there were times when every Tibetan was expected to be activists. There came times when, we all started saying that you can be anything, you don't have to be an activist. And, but I think now is a time when I feel like we are shortage of activists within the Tibetan community. I see so many younger generation Tibetans, really pumped up, doing a lot of things, making sure that they're taking our time. I want to give credit to them, for what they are doing, the determination that they are putting in, the information they are receiving, how they convert that information into reminiscing the voices of Tibetans inside Tibet. I would say I really want to give them credit for this. Along with that, I think it's important in terms of policy, how a Tibetan government in exile, how do we make sure that, this information relaying becomes safer, and how we're able to successfully convert that into Tibet advocacy in the form of, making sure that there are many more Tibet policies. When I say Tibet policy, I am focusing on Tibetans inside Tibet, because when it comes to a nation like India, we know the kind of support the government of India has provided for the exile establishment, of course, for His Holiness and the entire Tibetan population in India. But what about what India has done and could do and should be doing for Tibetans inside Tibet? If not for the Tibetans inside Tibet, but for the security for India. So I think this is something that I want to see, this conversion of information and conversion of information on the human rights abuses inside Tibet turn into a strong, a support system for the Tibet advocacy. And I would say that, what we should be doing as Tibetans is making sure that, we are not stuck to our own lives. This is something that we've all imbibed from our past generation, or like each one of us, our fathers, our mothers, our grandparents, telling us that, you are the future generation, right? You are the future seed. Hence, you have the responsibility. I think it's important that we continue the narrative of handing over that message, because it might seem so routine for us, but it has been really, really the foundation of how we have survived over the years. Of course, we have had, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama ensuring that we all stuck together, reminding us of his message. But how do we ensure, if we are in a space where the 14th Dalai Lama is not there, how do we ensure that his strong message continues to really inspire the future generation if we are not free by that time, right? So I think this is important, that the exiled Tibetan government not just celebrate His Holiness's legacy, but what are the ideas that we have in place? What are the policies we have in place to make sure that we see a constructive result in terms of representing the Tibetans inside Tibet?
Thank you. And that point about getting information out of Tibet safely, that's very important. I think especially in the context of extraterritorial surveillance, even those of us who've been in institutions in the West, know this, and more alarming now. So there's one more question before we come to Tenchula, who wanted to respond to the previous one. I'll just add this one as well. And this one's actually about His Holiness's friendship with Desmond Tutu. And anything to say about that? And they also both, of course, share the distinction of being Nobel laureates for peace. So if anything on that friendship in particular, or the previous question, Tenchula.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to touch upon, because that's an important thing for us in this space. As we look at Tibet, inside Tibet today, we see that China's hold over everything that goes on inside Tibet is more stronger than ever. And information that comes between back and forth is so much less, and the borders are so much now tighter, and there's less travel. So in that space, I think it's really important that we don't stop paying attention, that we pay even more attention. So one of the things that in our effort at ICT, what we have done is we produce every fortnight a report called Tibet Roundup that looks at, not everything that we hear from Tibet can make into news reports, because the information we get is so little. So based on what we have, we look at that, so that we're not separated from keeping our hand on the pulse of what goes on inside Tibet. And I think that's something we as an exile community need to learn to do more of. I don't think we do it. I agree with Daula that we don't do enough of that. And trying to figure that space. The other thing is in the international space now, as there is more of a realization of the reality of what China is, I think there's more space for Tibetans to exert space for legislation and different efforts at different spaces. So that's something that we can be better at. We can also be better at communicating, especially today, that what happens in Tibet does not impact just Tibet alone. It impacts the larger space outside, especially Tibet's rivers, impact the whole of Asia and the communities around and the border areas as well. So just talking about Tibet in that global space, and learning how we do that, educating, learning, empowering. I think these are spaces that that we have to be better at, and we have to empower our younger Tibetans and others that we bring into the movement to shoulder that. Yeah, so I just wanted to share that. And on Archbishop Desmond Tutu and His Holiness, the Mission Joy is a film, and Book of Joy. I mean, these two are individuals, I think, with a very unique friendship. And part of it is also because of the lives they led. They had both such, enormous challenges that they were both shouldering, and they came out of that, but they always had a sense of putting others first, a sense of tackling things with very practical steps and dealing with, situations with a vision and with ways that you bringing people together and spreading joy. Because even though they did not look at their challenges with hunchback frowns, they just took it on as, as part of them, and invigorated movements around them. So I think, it's inspiring lives that they led. And we are lucky to have that documented, and that friendship in books and in films. And that's something we can share and learn from.
Yeah. And in fact, the third person that comes to my mind is the Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who also spent most of his life in exile in France. And he was able to return to Vietnam in his final months. And when that happened, I actually, thought about His Holiness and, being able to return to Tibet. And in fact, our webinar's poster had the Tibetan flag over the potala, which I thought was very beautiful. And to the point about the environment, actually, a quarter of the world's population is sustained on rivers that come out of Tibet. So it's really something that all of you have been saying. This isn't just about the Tibetan people. Large parts of northern and eastern India are sustained by those rivers as well. So it's about all of us have a stake in what happens in Tibet. So thank you so much to all our panelists. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I hope we'll have many, many more of these. I want to now hand it over to Dr. Carsten Klein, who's the Regional Director for FNF South Asia. Over to you, Dr. Klein.
Yes, hello, and Tashivelek from New Delhi. Thank you very much for this extremely relevant and good discussion in this extremely important year for the Tibetan movement, but also beyond the Tibetan movement, the 90th birthday year of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The Friedrich-Naumann Foundation will definitely continue with this series on important matters on the Tibetan way ahead in the future as well. So thank you very much, especially to our dear panelists, to the moderator. Allow me just to mention one or two points. I think it is of extremely importance that all of us, being observers and friends of the Tibetan movement, that we all raise also in future times the awareness of the initiatives undertaken by CTA and the Dalai Lama. I think that it is extremely relevant that in many political, diplomatic, and especially parliamentarian cycles, we discuss issues of Tibetan relevance, because all these issues are of strategic relevance, of geostrategic relevance. Last, we discussed here in our panel the water issue. That is, of course, one of the most important ones. Security plays a role. Minorities, diversity plays a significant role. All these different perspectives clearly show how important it is, and it would be that especially in future parliamentarian gatherings all around the world, the people, the parliamentarians, the decision maker take the opportunity to discuss affairs of the Tibetan cause also for the future, because this Tibetan cause in the region shows, as you also said, a very clear democratic role model. And secondly, it is of very strategic relevance, not only regarding Tibet itself, the Tibetan plateau, but far beyond that as well. And it is extremely important that we always reflect and uphold Dalai Lama's vision of dialogue, of harmony, and of peaceful coexistence. I would say, ladies and gentlemen, that that is really a high time for discussing these especially peaceful approaches all around the world. And here again, it is clearly seen that that is also a role model, a pure approach of peace and compassion, not only in the region, but far beyond that. Thank you very much again to all of you, dear panelists. I'm very, very happy that we see each other in future again. Let me also thank you, the audience of this evening. I know that amongst you are many politicians, journalists, diplomats, friends from the German Bhutan Himalaya Foundation, the German Indian Foundation. Thank you very much for being with us in this program. Thank you to the media. I know that we have got some Austrian friends here, experts on Tibetan issues in media. Thank you to my team, especially Nupur Hasija, not to forget our dear long-lasting friends Norsang and Tenzing Paljor. Thanks for supporting us as always. I wish you, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, a very good evening. Stay tuned to Friedrich-Naumann Foundation, and thank you very much for being with us tonight. You could follow up on all those initiatives on social media. And in social media, we would also be very happy to inform you on ongoing projects related to the Tibetan cause and beyond that. Thank you very much. Have a great evening and
Thank you.
goodbye from New Delhi.
Thank you.